Gather round, I want to tell you a story. The story of how one man, a leftist professor, Bernie voter, and liberal arts college educator, found himself through a series of events beyond his control, helplessly entangled in a web so dark and so intellectual that he watched as his reputation transformed before his eyes into becoming more and more associated with the far right and less with his own political self-identification. Bret Weinstein is an obviously smart guy, an expert in evolutionary biology, and an, I would say, engaging speaker, though he does pal around with the likes of Ben Shapiro, Andy Ngo, and members of Project Veritas. He has been described by himself and others as a liberal or a leftist who is just unafraid of speaking the truth.
Tucker has a lot of left-wing people on. You know, he had Bret Weinstein on, who's very progressive. He has Tulsi Gabbard on.
If you teach at Evergreen, I'm sure you're, a Hillary voter. But you had this.
No, not a Hillary voter. I'm a deeply progressive person, and I must say
there you go.
I'm troubled by what this implies about the current state of the left.
I'm a Bernie Sanders voter. If I'm alt-right, I mean, where are they?
Ladies and gentlemen, Bret Weinstein. A truly fascinating case. One of the most mysterious enigmas in the history of riddles. What would make someone act like this? Well, I've got a theory, a sort of grand unifying theory of geometric Bret Weinstein that I believe should answer the age-old question, why is Bret Weinstein like this? But before I get into my theory, I first would like to tell you about everything that's happened in Bret Weinstein's whole entire life. So buckle up, this is going to be my longest video, hopefully ever. Think of it as a Quentin Reviews video where he watched the worst Disney Channel show ever made. Oh no, I didn't realize Joe Rogan was such a prominent recurring character on iCarly. It's gonna be rough, let's do it. Now I'm going to begin our story on the very cusp of the pandemic, February 19th, 2020, when fellow public intellectuals and former boy genius duo Bret and Eric Weinstein sat down on Eric's podcast, The Portal, to talk about old times. But it wasn't a happy sort of reminiscing. You see, Eric, the older Weinstein, had a bone to pick with Bret, the cooler Weinstein.
Because you're going to do this thing where you downplay your gift, and I'm sick of it. I'm tired of it. I've had it. You have a place in the history of science that you are not taking up, you are not advocating for. There's something that you don't like about this.
Eric was disturbed that while Bret had made himself famous, nobody respected him as a scientist. Bret had recently sat down with evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, who had failed to show Bret the respect he was due when Bret shared some thoughts he had about beavers.
Serving the interests of the underlying genome the same way ponds are serving the interests of the underlying beaver genome.
I'm familiar with the fallacy. That is absolutely wrong.
The sad, hard truth of the matter was that nobody knew Bret from his scientific accomplishments. They knew him from something else. As Bret himself put it,
to the extent that I am recognized, it is typically as a result of the meltdown at Evergreen and my stance.
It's Evergreen State College.
Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, where I taught for 14 years.
And Bret was right. If you were familiar with Bret Weinstein before February 2020, you more than likely knew him from what happened with him at Evergreen College years earlier. Let's flash back to that. The Evergreen Years. After completing his PhD, Bret eventually joined his wife, Heather Haying, another evolutionary biologist, teaching at a tiny liberal arts school called Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Bret, and especially his wife Heather, were very popular and well-liked teachers at Evergreen. They were both able to turn evolutionary biology into something fun and interesting that had surprisingly practical applications to everyday life. Even one of his more outspoken critics of the time, fellow Evergreen educator Nancy Kopelman, acknowledged Bret's popularity with the students.
Weinstein was indeed a popular professor, and his classes tended to be full with waiting lists. He is a bright and entertaining person. He's witty, funny, and a creative thinker. He was fond of claiming that college in general was largely a sham, but that the knowledge students would gain in his classes was so profound, so life-changing, so unusual, so startling that something completely unique and almost impossible to describe would happen to them when they studied with him.
At the same time, she criticized his over-reliance on his particular scientific niche.
He is convinced that evolutionary theory is the grand organizing principle for virtually everything, and that other fields are derivative. Liberal arts professors embrace complexity. We encourage students to see value in all disciplines. He did not.
Years later, Richard Dawkins would criticize Bret in the exact same way during their talk, reminding him that evolutionary biology is not the only lens through which to view the world.
This is not Darwinism. This is something else, which historians deal with, sociologists deal with, psychologists deal with. This is not Darwinism. It's not helpful to try to couch this in what sounds like Darwinian terms.
Now, Evergreen is not like other colleges. It allows for small class sizes taught by 2 professors working together, and most importantly, professors had a high degree of control over how their subjects were taught. Bret particularly enjoyed this aspect of Evergreen, understandably so. I mean, would you rather work at McDonald's or at a liberal arts McDonald's, where you can prepare those burgers however you think is best? All right, now I gotta talk about the incident. Now, a truly unnecessary amount of words have already been written, documentary filmed, and most of all podcasted about the incident that pushed Bret into mainstream consciousness, nearly always from a perspective that's sympathetic to Bret's role in it. And for good reason, right? I mean, for those of you unfamiliar, if you do look into the existing coverage, what you'll find is Bret Weinstein making very reasonable objections to what seems like an, at best, well-intentioned but poorly executed bit of activism, and receiving an enormous amount of backlash for it, eventually leading to Bret's resignation from Evergreen State College. But let's look into what happened one last time, just for fun. Despite having a bit of a reputation as a loony lefty college, Evergreen does appear to have had a genuine problem with the way it treated its black and brown students, and a tendency to hire mainly white faculty. Student activists attempted to fight these injustices in ways that were definitely sometimes cringe.
Oh, hold on one second. Hold on. The senior administrators, you have to ask for permission and commit some things before boarding the canoe.
Personally, I am committed to making Evergreen a more student-ready campus, to be able to promote equity and inclusion in the classroom and outside the classroom.
Sometimes extremely funny and cool.
As my fellow trustees will attest, Danny's...
It's not yours either.
Protesters disrupt a faculty meeting. The protesters literally disrupt the meeting, take the cake, the retirement cake, and march out of the room.
We need extra hands to bring food to the students.
It's full Lord of the Flies.
Baby got fancy meeting cake.
Come on now, that's awesome. They literally walked into a teacher party and stole their cake. Incredible footage. Anyway, on one regrettable occasion, the students did use physical force to prevent the college president from using the bathroom.
So you have to watch that door, watch all the doors, watch the windows. You need to keep eyes on them. And somebody needs to go in that room real quick to make sure that there's no way in that room for them.
I mean, essentially sounded like you're being held hostage there.
Now, none of that has anything to do with Bret Weinstein, but clips like that are played over and over again just to paint a picture of how unhinged and unreasonable these student activists were. Eric Weinstein actually called this the closest thing to a Maoist revolution ever on U.S. soil, which is honestly pretty apt. We all remember the terrible days when Chairman Mao rounded up the landlords and stole their birthday cake.
It's full Lord of the Flies.
Sorry, I just wanted an excuse to play that clip again. I love it. Now, where Bret Weinstein became involved was around an event that's as annoying to explain as it was often explained incorrectly, the infamous Evergreen Day of Absence. Okay, all right. So the Day of Absence was traditionally a day at Evergreen where students of color could leave campus for the day to emphasize their importance and their presence, while white allies could attend relevant anti-racist seminars located on campus, and the students of color who chose to participate could attend similar seminars located at a separate off-campus location. In 2017, they decided to reverse this tradition where instead of black students choosing to leave campus for the day, white allies were encouraged to attend these anti-racist seminars now located at the same off-campus location that the black students would typically go to. An email was sent to professors explaining this change.
Please notice that in 2017, for the first time, we are reversing the pattern of previous years. Our Day of Absence program is specially designed for faculty, staff, and students of color will happen on campus this year, while our concurrent program for allies will take place off campus.
I think most people would probably have taken this as a rather innocuous change, but not Bret Weinstein, who reply-alled to this email with an email of his own.
There's a huge difference between a group or coalition deciding to voluntarily absent themselves from a shared space in order to highlight their vital and underappreciated roles, and a group or coalition encouraging another group to go away. The first is a forceful call to consciousness, which is, of course, crippling to the logic of oppression. The second is a show of force and an act of oppression in and of itself.
Now, if the Day of Absence had been mandatory and enforced, that would be one thing. But from what I can gather, it was purely voluntary. Now, when Bret contrasts the black students as a group choosing to voluntarily absent themselves with the white students as victims of a group encouraging them to go away, he's ignoring the fact that any white student choosing to absent themselves from campus is doing so because they see themselves as allies to the oppressed black community. Right? By choosing to attend these seminars, they're just as much voluntarily absenting themselves as the black students in years prior. In fact, they were not expecting all white faculty members and students to leave campus for the day and go to these off-campus seminars. In fact, they only had capacity for 200 people. But that was beside the point. The Day of Absence was almost never properly explained when it blew up in right-wing media. Bret Weinstein later went on Tucker Carlson's show where the protest was inaccurately described like this.
Wow. Professor Bret Weinstein joins us now. Professor, first of all, thank you for coming on. That looks like something, out of Phnom Penh, 1975. Was that, what exactly was going on there? What happened?
50 or so students decided to disrupt the class that I was holding.
Because you wouldn't leave campus because you're white?
Well, they imagine that I am a racist.
Does it make you racist to disagree with the methods that others have chosen to protest racism? Of course not. That said, I think anyone positioning themselves in opposition to an anti-racist movement like this earns at least an eyebrow raise. They were just asking white people to go to a different place for their seminar. I support anti-racism, but I don't think white people should walk an extra 15 minutes. That's what the black people should do. So when I read his original email, that part seemed more out of touch than racist to me. Either that or just poor reading comprehension. Bret's a busy guy. He gets a lot of emails. He's probably skimming through like, blah, blah, blah. We're reversing the pattern of previous Day of Absences, blah, 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 by putting all white people in a gulag. I don't want that. Could happen to anyone, really. I think that the much more racist part was another section of the email which read,
if there was interest in a public presentation and discussion of race through a scientific/evolutionary lens, I would be quite willing to organize such an event. Everyone would be equally welcome and encouraged to attend such a forum, irrespective of ethnicity, belief structure, native language, political leaning, or position at the college. My only requirement would be that people attend with an open mind and a willingness to act in good faith. Hey, come listen to me talk about how white people are genetically superior, but you gotta be chill about it. Don't fucking come and be weird.
This is an absolutely wild thing to offer to an anti-racist protest. At best, it's completely tone deaf. I'm not sure what Bret means by a discussion of race through a scientific biological lens, but it definitely sounds like some good old-fashioned scientific racism. A race, as we understand it today, is a social construction invented to facilitate colonialism and slavery. It is not an innate biological property. Bret's like, it's racist to ask white people to stand in solidarity with black people. How about instead, I do a presentation on how the races are different species? Something that might not seem like a big deal, but really bothers me. Every single time I've seen Bret talk about this letter, he subtly changes the wording of it. So he didn't say it was an evolutionary discussion of race he was offering. He says it was an evolutionary discussion of racism.
I suggested that I would be willing to give a lecture to anybody who wanted to come about what I understand to be the evolutionary context of racism. They assumed that if I said evolution and racism, that I was going to give a eugenics lecture or something like that.
That's completely different, right? I mean, like, it's still pretty tone deaf, but it's at least defensible. To be as charitable to Bret as possible, I'm going to assume he meant to type racism, but he typed race instead. Whoops, autocorrect. I meant to say that I'd be talking about the evolutionary purposes of an in-group, out-group bias, but I accidentally slipped my fingies and told everyone I'd be setting up a complimentary skull measuring booth. Anyway, when Bret sent out this email, the student protesters, who were originally protesting the systemic racism of the university, suddenly had a symbolic scapegoat to attack. They concentrated their energy on protesting Bret Weinstein, surrounding him and chanting, events which Bret Weinstein was careful not to overstate the importance of.
Fuck you. Please. Piece of shit. Listen, somebody kick this. Do you understand? History could pivot in this hallway right now. If history could pivot in the direction of the values that you are standing here for.
Yeah, resign.
What?
Resign.
The original student activist movement, which was about the school administration, suddenly shifted to being about Bret Weinstein, as Michael Brooks put it in Against the Web.
I suspect that it's correct to ask whether an increasingly corporatized administration was playing divide and conquer by deflecting student anger away from the real decision makers onto Professor Weinstein, who was arrogant and tone-deaf enough about the students' legitimate anger and activism to make for an easy target. The way activists turn their attention to this ridiculous and thoroughly unimpressive person, who nonetheless has connections, turned him into the cause célèbre for the right.
And Bret was a cause the right was ready to célébrer for standing up against the oppressive tyranny of giving white people the option of skipping school for a day and learning about microaggressions. Bret was invited onto Tucker, he authored an article in the Wall Street Journal, and most importantly of all, was interviewed on the Joe Rogan Experience. Now this is what I'll be calling the Weinstein timeline, which shows Google searches for Bret over time. Anytime there's a massive spike, it's usually from when he did a Joe Rogan podcast. As you can see, the first big spike coincides with June 2017, when Bret Weinstein was officially introduced to fans of the Joe Rogan Experience. The Bald Man's Platform, a Bret Weinstein adventure. It's a very interesting interview, conducted while Bret was technically still on the payroll at Evergreen. Joe Rogan introduces him as a professor at the center of a huge controversy and gives Bret the floor to explain himself. Bret explains that the students at Evergreen are quick to call anything racist, even random hand gestures made by the university president.
I don't want to caricature this because I really think it's very important. As preposterous as what's going on is, I think it's very important that we understand it. I think the complaint about the hand gestures was that they represented microaggressions.
What was he doing?
That's my problem, George. You keep doing these little hand movements or whatever.
This can be portrayed as a microaggression in some way. You're speaking.
How is this a microaggression?
I mean,
You're
it
moving
isn't.
your hands
Well,
around?
we should talk about whether microaggression is even a good category. But
right.
Notice how careful Bret is with his words, and notice how calm and measured he is. This is a huge part of Bret Weinstein's appeal. He explains the situation at Evergreen calmly, slowly, and rationally, and when you hear it, it's kind of hard to have much sympathy for the students at Evergreen. How could anyone want to hurt Professor Xanax over here? I mean, Bret isn't always careful with his words. At one point, he's still talking about the university president's hand gestures. Bret says this.
That's not so unlike a black person, a black man, let's say, being told that he's not allowed to look a white woman in the eye, right? It's that kind of thing having been reversed.
No, it isn't like that, Bret. It's not like that at all. But the really important thing to take away from this interview is how much Joe Rogan seems to like Bret Weinstein. At the end of a 2.5-hour conversation, Rogan is ready to go all in on the Bret train. At this point, Bret Weinstein is still hoping to keep his job as a professor at Evergreen, but Joe explicitly tells him that if the professor thing doesn't work out, Rogan will do whatever he can to help Bret out. A promise which Joe Rogan absolutely kept. So began Bret Weinstein's ascent into what would eventually be called the intellectual dark web. The webby, dark, and intellectual tales of the intellectual dark web. Now, Bret all of a sudden found himself hanging out with some pretty major figures. Joe Rogan, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, and somehow, I've never quite been clear on how this happened, but Eric Weinstein managed to ride his brother's coattails into mainstream relevance as well. Eric actually coined the term intellectual dark web to describe this particular group of public intellectuals. Now, this is off topic, but I do want to take a minute to emphasize just how corny this is of Eric Weinstein. Imagine you've been unpopular your whole life, and then all of a sudden in high school you start hanging out with the cool kids, but then your older brother somehow starts hanging out with your friends too, but he is not chill about it at all. He's like, oh, we're part of a gang. Yeah, we're called the Genius Phoenix Gang. That's how everyone's got to refer to us from now on. It's like, guys, calm down, Eric. Just try and be cool around my new cool friends, okay? So the intellectual dark web, what does that refer to exactly? Well, intellectual, of course, is about the academic qualifications of those in the IDW, while dark web refers to a place on the internet where you can use cryptocurrency to pay for assassinations and child pornography. It's not all bad, though. You can also buy drugs. The term was then popularized by Barry Weiss's infamous New York Times article, Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web, which profiled such figures as Eric Weinstein, Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Sam Harris, Christina Hoff Sommers, Michael Shermer, Bret's wife Heather Haying, and, of course, Bret Weinstein himself. Now, I am not sure why, during the photo shoot, Bret chose to grab this tree's dick, but I am not upset about it at all. Everybody else looks super badass, and Bret looks like he's jerking off the Grinch, so even more badass. At this point, things were going great for Bret. He and his wife Heather had resigned from Evergreen and collected a substantial payout from the school, and he was becoming hugely popular thanks to his media appearances and his undeniable talent for speaking with the calm, cool, collected tone of someone who really knows what they're talking about. You know, this is the type of play that we've seen time and time again, right? It's a grift as old as time. Step 1, be any kind of a university professor. Step 2, make a stand against wokeness. Step 3, you're famous. You can live off of your success from that forever. Go on Joe Rogan and collect those Patreon dollars because you did it. It's time to cash in. It's even easier than being a conservative comedian. Let's call it the Jordan Peterson method. But when Jordan Peterson had blown up in a similar way to how Bret did, but with transphobia instead of racism, he already had a YouTube channel filled with long lectures of his from U of T. Bret didn't have that. So in order to cash in on his success here, he decided to start a YouTube channel. It took him a little while to find his niche. Early videos are some pretty interesting science nerd type videos on Bret's thoughts about various subjects and some pretty brutal puns.
How cool would it be if our Bill of Rights went to 11? No, really, how cool would it be if our Bill of Rights went to 11? Yes, I think they would have been very focused on sustainability and reversibility.
How cool would it be, Bret? Your comedy career is heating up uncontrollably, much like the planet. Oh boy. Eventually, Bret decided to start a podcast, the Dark Horse Podcast. Now, considering his dyed-in-the-wool progressive bona fides, his choices for his first few guests were quite odd. His first guest was everyone's favorite anti-fascist Andy Ngo, and his second guest was a member of Project Veritas. I don't know how many Bernie bros you know, but this type of company is, I would say, unusual. Bret, like many others in the IDW, established a loyal fan base and was part of the IDW ecosystem of appearing on each other's shows. He appeared again and again on the Joe Rogan podcast, for example, and sometimes with other IDW members like Jordan Peterson. Now, to be totally honest with you, I am your typical uneducated guy who loves hearing smart people talk about smart things to make me feel smart. I'm a real Joe Rogan type in that way. And to be honest, I find a lot of the factoids about the natural world that Bret shares really interesting and fun. But there's often a way that he frames it that just leaves a really bad taste in my mouth. So there's an episode of Joe Rogan where Bret Weinstein and his wife Heather Haying show up, and Heather incidentally has the exact same voice as her husband. That same like calm, cool, gravelly sort of thing. Like, I wonder if one of them stole it from the other one, or maybe, you know, they always both spoke like that, and one day their vocal fries met across a crowded room and they knew it was love. Heather, reminder, was also an evolutionary biology professor at Evergreen who resigned in solidarity with Bret during the protests against him. So on this episode, they tell their friend Joe Rogan about all the weird ways that animals like to have sex. And it's great hearing them talk about all the strange sex things that aphids and the whiptail lizard do, and how flowers kind of have cocks. Like, that's the exact type of stuff I want to hear, you know? But at the beginning of the episode, they frame this whole discussion as being a argument against gender ideology.
Let's deal with the transgender issue. In general, there's a sense that it is disrespectful not to simply recognize anybody who has decided to transition as a full-fledged member of the sex to which they have moved. If you say a person who identifies as a particular sex is that sex, suddenly you've actually caused a whole bunch of consequences that you weren't thinking of over in a biology class.
Oh, great point, Bret. If we let trans people exist, then lizards will forget how to bone each other. Not enough people are talking about how trans people are cock-blocking lizards every single day. Now, I'm not sure why Bret chose to make himself the Bill Nye of transphobia in this episode, but I am sure that it did not alienate him from Joe Rogan's audience very much. I mean, with other members of the IDW holding explicitly transphobic beliefs, like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, and let's not forget Joe Rogan himself, it wasn't a particularly risky move for Bret and Heather to come out against trans people. I think this is indicative of a tendency Bret has, a type of learned behavior, where he's usually going to use his scientific knowledge and his platform to attack some perceived idea of wokeness, whether that be anti-racism or trans people existing. And it makes sense from a financial perspective because every single time he pulls this move, he gets more subscribers and a bigger audience. Sure, those audience does become increasingly reactionary, but that doesn't matter. They still got his money. They still got money, but they still got money. Oh, here we are. We've made it to that interview I started the video with. The one where Bret complains that no one knows him from his scientific genius. They only know him from his time at Evergreen. Well, as it turns out, a crucial piece of the Bret Weinstein puzzle was dropped in this podcast episode. Because it turns out that Bret actually did come up with an earth-shattering, paradigm-shifting scientific discovery one time, but nobody knows about it.
And that story, unfortunately, has not really been told. And it is, in some sense, your central origin story.
It's a pretty good one, and it definitely changed the way I saw myself in a way that has been very productive.
So this interview comes after Bret had been completely disrespected by renowned evolutionary biologist, transphobe, and young Sheldon superfan Richard Dawkins.
Are a means to an end employed by beavers to preserve food over the winter, among other things.
I can only quote W.B. Yeats, you are still wrecked among heathen dreams.
Wait, I don't think I speak English well enough to understand what you just accused me of.
What Dawkins didn't know, what nobody seemed to know, was that way back when Bret was just an itty-bitty PhD student, he'd stumbled across a scientific theory that could revolutionize the world. With this setup, Bret began to tell this unheard story, this deleted scene from the Bret Weinstein theatrical cut. So, okay, let me explain Bret's theory in a way that everyone can understand. Telomeres are a part of chromosomes. They're on the end, and they can be either short or long. Now, longer telomeres are associated with an increased life expectancy, but also an increased cancer risk. Or it might be the other way around, I'm not sure. Anyway, the scientific community has always believed that mice have short telomeres, and yet mice are susceptible to cancer. So, that doesn't make sense, right? Well, what Bret figured out was it's only lab mice that have these topsy-turvy telomeres, whereas wild mice have telomeres that are, the way that we would expect them to be. So what that means is, ergo quid quo, every conclusion that we've drawn from experimentation on mice could be wrong, and all medicine could be poison. That seems like a big deal.
All of the science relative at least to cancer, senescence, wound healing, all of the science that is stacked on these mice that is contingent on their function relative to their telomeres is all compromised. It's malpractice at an incredible level.
Hopefully my explanation made sense to you, because I'll be honest, I don't really get it. What is a telomere? I didn't look it up, and I'm afraid I simply don't care enough to ever learn. As far as my expertise can detect, Bret's theory about lab mice is just as likely to be revolutionary and world-changing as it is to be complete bullshit. I don't know. For our purposes, though, it actually doesn't matter whether the story is true or not. What's important is the story of its publication and how that affected Bret Weinstein's character arc. Bret sent this theory around to several experts in the field. Apparently, many of them gave him very harsh criticism, like Carol Greider, who essentially told him that his ideas were dumb and bad and he should give up. Remember that name because it'll be important later. He sent his theory to Nature magazine, which, bear in mind, is like the most prestigious scientific journal on Earth, and his submission was rejected. He eventually did find a smaller journal to publish it, but they decided not to publish it right away, choosing instead to keep it in-house, a decision that Bret found to be very evil.
So heartbreaking. What she has effectively done is decided, I could publish this result.
And then everyone would have it.
Huge. But then I'm on a level playing field with everybody else. If I don't publish this result, then I can start predicting other results. Nobody will know how I am doing that thing. I will look like a super genius. Holding it in-house is a mechanism for a whole slew of papers.
Which... could they do that? Like, would they do that? Is that a thing that happens in science? I mean, again, I don't know. But they did eventually publish his study anyway, so I'm not even really sure what Bret is complaining about here. And here's another thing. You remember that scientist, Carol Greider, the one who took a shit all over Bret's cool idea about the mice? You should remember her. I just brought her up like 30 seconds ago. I mean, this is the shortest let's put a pin in that situation possible. You really should remember her. Anyway, a few years later, she won the Nobel Prize for her scientific work. And during her acceptance speech, she presented Bret's thesis on the Nobel stage.
In these cells. And so we decided to use mouse genetics. And what's shown here are mouse chromosomes in a metaphase spread, as you saw earlier from Liz's talk, where the blue is the DAPI-stained chromosome and the red...
So again, I am not an expert in this kind of thing, and I'm honestly not sure if Bret's recollection of this, his retelling, is accurate, because it does come off a lot like a grand conspiracy theory that coincidentally explains one man's failure to make a name for himself in biology. But I want to note a few things. First, it's not really surprising that Nature would reject an application by a PhD student or by anyone. They receive a ton of submissions and they reject almost all of them. So on its own, that is not evidence of a conspiracy. Now, Bret did eventually find someone to publish his paper, which is really impressive considering he hadn't even finished his PhD yet. Yes, they kept it in-house for a while, but they still published it like a year later, and the timelines on these things can be long. As for Carol Greider and the Nobel Prize, there are a few things that Bret and Eric did not really make clear in this podcast. One is that she got the Nobel Prize for her entire career in biology, not just for the study that Bret says she stole from him. And also, looking over a list of her work, it seems she had several studies about the telomeres of mice done before Bret had even started his academic career. Whatever side is true, what's undeniable is the effect this had on Bret's character development. What was he thinking at the time? We can never know for sure, and to speculate on someone's internal thought process like this would be completely irresponsible and also something which I will now do. Bret Weinstein, a genius from a family of geniuses, had his world-changing discovery suppressed and stolen from him by more powerful people in the scientific world, one of whom later won the Nobel Prize for it. Bret had a Nobel-worthy idea snatched away from him. It's not right. But sorry, big mouse telomere, Bret wasn't licked yet. He made a solemn vow right then and there that he would not rest, he would not sleep for an instant until he'd proven to the world that he too was a smart science guy. Oh, he'd show them. He'd show all of them. Now, this might sound strange at this point in the video essay, given how much I've been clowning on the guy, but I find it really easy to empathize with Bret here. Sure, he made truckloads of money and became hugely successful by just being a living, breathing SJW cringe compilation video. But I don't believe that being an international symbol of reactionary politics was ever what Bret had dreamed for himself. Bret doesn't want to be Charlie Kirk, damn it! He wants to be Charlie Darwin. If only there was some massive global event, some worldwide catastrophe that Bret could use to make himself known for his scientific genius. Bret and the big spike. Now, when coronavirus dropped, it presented a huge opportunity for Bret Weinstein. All of a sudden, people were very interested in what scientists had to say, especially if what they had to say went against the mainstream liberal media. Bret, as we've seen, was already working this type of audience, so it was a natural transition for him. By June of 2020, Bret had so many opinions about coronavirus and other issues of the day. He'd already spent months gargling them on the Dark Horse podcast, but now it was time to spit them into the Joe Rogan sink. I'll say right off the top here, not all of Bret's opinions on coronavirus were wrong. On occasion, he was very correct. For example, back when the CDC was advising people not to wear masks, Bret was insisting on his show that masks were good, wearing a bandana around his neck at all times.
So, and I don't know why we are pushing this madness of masks that scream medical.
Yeah, you've got a bandana.
I do.
Yeah.
But, the fact is the bandana, all right, maybe I look like a goofball, but the fact is it's more fashionable, in my opinion, than a medical mask.
Oh, you're being fashionable. That's cute.
Oh, it's very cool, Bret. You look like the only guy at Black Block carrying around a copy of The Bell Curve. You look like a Westworld robot that gives you a side quest denying medical aid to trans people. Well done, buddy. I mean, actually, I bought this to make fun of you, but I actually really like it. I'm gonna wear this unironically. I just like the way it makes me feel. Of course, not all of Bret's COVID era opinions were strictly public health related. The second the podcast starts, Joe Rogan takes the opportunity to congratulate Bret on his Nostradamus level ability to predict that BLM would be a thing.
If anybody sounded the alarm that all this madness was going to come to fruition in the real world, it's you, sir. You were the guy. What's happening at Evergreen, and now it spills out into the real world.
Just like I said it was gonna.
You did.
I did. I said it in several different places, and pretty clearly,
According to Bret, what happened to him at Evergreen was just a microcosm of where the movement for Black Lives would eventually go. And I really don't know if you want to put yourself at that point in the metaphor, Bret.
I think that this is actually the people who are catching up to the fact that Evergreen has now spilled over into the world have not caught up to the fact that this is unstoppable at this point. And that means that the next set of predictions are far more dire.
They talk about how the BLM movement has become anarchist, which I don't think is really true. And then Bret drops a bomb. You might be able to predict what it is. I'm going to put a content warning here for discussion of George Floyd's murder and Bret's very bad take on it. So skip to this time code if you'd like to avoid that discussion. All right, here's Bret's thing. He doesn't believe that George Floyd was murdered necessarily. The furthest he's willing to go is to say that it was a huge miscarriage of justice. He also doesn't believe that Derek Chauvin would be convicted by an honest court of law.
We don't know. In the public, based on what we have seen, we don't know this to have been murder, because if this was Derek Chauvin being a dick, that is for a court to decide whether or not it is murder. In other words, if he was doing the policy as the policy is laid out based on the criteria that would trigger the policy.
Have you read any of this?
The real point here is not that he is innocent. I don't believe him to be innocent. My real point is that we are all acting as if we have seen with our own eyes something that is unambiguously murder. I believe we saw something that may well have been murder and may well not have been murder, and that the way that we determine whether it is murder is in a courtroom with due process.
Now, Joe Rogan is wrong about a ton of stuff, from trans people to Tulsi Gabbard, and he also has a tendency to just go along with whatever his guest at the moment is saying and not challenge anyone. But to give Joe some credit, he actually does challenge Bret directly on his George Floyd opinions, and I think he does a pretty good job of it.
If I'm an expert on choking people. You know, I understand what happens to the brain when you cut off the blood supply. I've had it done to me. I know I could kill a man that way. I know I could.
Yeah.
If I decided to lean on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds with all my weight, that's a dead person. If your neck, one side of your neck is on the concrete and the other side is 200 pounds of my body all focused on my knee, and I'm balancing my weight on your neck, you're a dead man. But that's what we saw, right? I know what you're saying, that maybe he also had a heart attack, but the idea that those two are not related seems to me to be outside of the realm of possibility.
Now, Joe Rogan is more of an expert in the study of choking people than Bret is in any field, but Bret still doesn't buy it, and he soon moves the conversation on to discussion of the lab leak theory. Now, keep in mind, this was back in June 2020, and unless you're Donald Trump, it was very hard to discuss the possibility that COVID leaked from a Chinese lab because it was so easily turned into animosity against Asian people and real-world violence against them. But Bret Weinstein was one of those brave people who was willing to not care about that.
And the story that is looking more and more likely, what I would call the lab leak hypothesis, is looking ever stronger.
Now, this is another one of Bret's predictions that people love to point to showcase his credibility, alongside him being correct about masks and him apparently predicting the BLM movement. With this one, it sort of makes sense because over time, the lab leak hypothesis has become more accepted. I'm not a scientist. Did I mention that already? But from what I understand, it's pretty much agreed that while a natural spillover is much more likely, almost any scientist would agree that a lab leak is at least possible. And I also think if you want to speculate about the lab leak hypothesis, that is totally okay, but you need to be careful not to contribute to any anti-Asian racism or feed the consent manufacturing machine for war with China. Is that too much to ask? But I'm sorry, Bret had no evidence to put this much weight behind such a theory in June 2020. So sure about it was Bret that he often cited an actual percentage chance the lab leak was true. 90%. Even today, if you're agnostic on the lab leak theory, it would be ridiculous to put a number to it like that, and even more ridiculous to make that number as high as 90%. But back in June 2020, Bret had absolutely no reason to be that confident. Bret would later state that 90% figure on Bill Maher's show.
It certainly is a 50-50, would you say that?
Oh, it's far more likely than that. As a matter of fact, I
Right.
said, I think in June, that the chances that it came from the lab looked to me to be about 90%.
But nobody watches that shit, so let's just stick with the Joe Rogan stuff. Honestly, I wouldn't give Bret too much credit on the lab leak stuff or, the masks or predicting BLM, because the guy was wrong about so much stuff too. He just had so many opinions. Some of them were bound to turn out okay. Like in the same Joe Rogan podcast, he talks about how if we'd only locked down for 6 weeks, COVID would have been just done right away, which the guy's full of shit. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Important to keep in mind here that this interview again coincided with by far the largest spike ever in people Googling Bret Weinstein's name, and presumably it also coincided with a huge bump in Patreon subscribers and YouTube ad revenue for Bret as well. Having these unpopular anti-woke opinions seems to work well for his brand, and if we can notice that sitting on the outside of all this, you have to imagine Bret Weinstein noticed as well. And now, the grand unifying theory of geometric Bret Weinstein. Who is Bret Weinstein? If you're familiar with Bret, or if you were reading the news in September, you probably know where this character's tragic hubris is about to lead him. But before we get to that, I have spent hours and hours of my life watching interviews and podcasts with this guy, and I've noticed he keeps doing the same 5 things over and over again. Once you see the pattern, it makes his whole deal make more sense. So I want to explain those 5 things before we get into the end game here. Number 1, delusions of grandeur. Now, you may have noticed that I've been sort of referring to Bret as if he's a fictional character for the purposes of this essay, and partially that's because it's just easier for me to imagine him as a tragic Shakespearean character driven to extremes by a combination of pride and circumstance, because it helps me to forget that he's actually a real-life person with a massive amount of trusting fans. But also, I think that's kind of how Bret Weinstein views himself, as the main character in an ongoing series called Reality. To Bret Weinstein, everything revolves around Bret. What happens to Bret affects the entire world.
And so I start going to members of the press. I think this is a huge goddamn story.
Oh my
Somebody
God,
is going to
you're
make a
self-promoting.
career on it. I retained an interest in the cellular biology. I saw these 2 things that needed to be connected, and I started to work on the puzzle. It turned out that that hypothesis would answer a great many questions that were otherwise very difficult to answer.
History could pivot in this hallway right now if we heard it.
The Evergreen scandal wasn't just the event that thrust Bret into the spotlight. It was intentional foreshadowing, inserted by the writers of Reality to tease the movement for Black Lives in 2020.
Evergreen has now spilled over into the world.
Over-reliance on evolutionary biology. Now, hand in hand with Bret's sense of importance about himself is his core belief that evolutionary biology, the subject he got a PhD in, is also the only field worth studying in any discipline. You know how sometimes at the beginning of a movie, like the first 10 minutes, there will be a scene in a lecture hall and it's only 20 seconds long. You don't really pay attention to it, but whatever it was that the professor was talking about is what saves the day in the end, or it's like the theme of the movie. That's how Bret views his time as a student. It's Chekhov's graduate degree. Of course evolutionary biology is going to save the world. Otherwise, why would he have spent so much time learning about it in Act 1?
Empowered by having an understanding of how things function evolutionarily that gives them a window into all sorts of things, including, human social dynamics and other things that affect us all the time.
It's this kind of attitude that led Bret to offer to teach students protesting racism about the evolutionary roots of race. This is the same thing that informs most of his transphobia. This is the thing that led even Richard Dawkins to say,
Not everything's about evolutionary biology, you fucking dipshit.
Wait. I don't think I speak English well enough to understand what you just accused me of.
Sorry, I did change the audio for that one, but that is kind of what he was saying anyway. Everyone is out to get Bret. They want to get Bret, but they haven't got Bret yet. Now, you might also have noticed that Bret is pretty prone to conspiratorial thinking, going all the way back to his groundbreaking theory about mice telomeres, which was not just ignored, but suppressed deliberately by the shadowy forces of Big Telomere, preventing him from earning his rightful place as a world-famous Nobel Prize-winning mouse nerd.
And I call up members of the press, and it's always the same, right?
Always the same.
It's always the same. They're very excited about this story.
Initially,
right.
The reporter
is excited.
Yeah. Talks to someone.
They talk to someone, and then either they stop returning your calls, or they say, I'm sorry, the story doesn't hang together. It's again and again and again.
Yeah.
And the only way to do it is to advance the idea as an equity-enhancing idea. In other words, you can say that that the full-time programs are anti-equity in the sense that if you are disadvantaged, you are less likely to be able to dedicate yourself full-time. Anyway, so if you wanted to advance that proposal, it had to be dressed up as equity-enhancing. And once it was equity-enhancing, it became very hard to challenge it because, of course, if you did challenge it, then you were anti-equity.
Boy, that's convoluted.
If Bret's life is the story, there's got to be an antagonist. The protests at Evergreen were a deliberate attempt by the administration to take away professors' freedom through the Trojan horse of equity. COVID was a lab leak. BLM is secretly run by Kropotkin or whatever. Anti-wokeism. So, is Joe Rogan right? Is Bret Weinstein a leftist? It's a bit nuanced. The short answer is no, but the long answer is no. No. What? I mean, I don't know. Bret might have been a card-carrying Bernie bro at one point, back when he was nothing more than a fun professor at a college for hippies. But when he launched his career by angrily refusing to participate in a voluntary protest for white allies, his priorities, if they were ever there, shifted. Pretty consistently, Bret has taken a stand against whatever he thinks is woke at the moment, from the lab leak theory to the Evergreen protests. It's kind of odd that a left-wing liberal seems to coincidentally always have the opinion that's most likely to get him shared on your least favorite uncle's Facebook page.
Something I've said many, many times is that the problem with this woke revolution is that it is not interested in ending oppression. It is interested in turning the tables of oppression. My sense is that now they have gone far too far. The offenses they claim have grown just so bizarre. They say Dr. Seuss wrote books that did harm, that we shouldn't be fooled by his fanciful charm.
And a lot of times that makes him look like an asshole, like when he's discussing student activists, the BLM movement, George Floyd, trans people, but sometimes he does end up being right, like when he was talking about masks, and there must be something I'm forgetting. The disclaimer. Based on how I've described Bret so far, he seems like a pretty ridiculous person, right? And in my opinion, he is. But why do so many people take him seriously? Although I think it's fair to say that a lot of the points Bret makes would not be out of place in an Alex Jones InfoWars rant or a QAnon Baker thread, Bret has perfected an air of credibility and authority. He's quick to point to his previous correct predictions to lend weight to his new theories, and he's also a master of the disclaimer.
And let me say, you have made some very strong claims. And I will say, I don't know if you're right. I cannot determine based on what I understand if you're right. But what I can say is that you are making sense. Now, I'm not saying that he's not guilty of murder. I think it's likely he is guilty of murder. But I don't know that he's guilty of murder yet. And my sense is that we have already marched so far down this road. We are already now speaking as if we can all agree that he's guilty of murder. right? This is frightening in and of itself, that your argument is completely coherent. Whether or not it is true, this is at least a question that should be engaged by those who are making policy around this. The fact that it's even plausible is a stunning
Well, you know, medical error is the third leading cause of death.
Yep.
Now, Bret isn't saying that they're putting something in the water to turn the freaking frogs gay. Of course he's not saying that. He's merely pointing out. No, I want to choose my words carefully here. He's not so much pointing out as he is making an observation as an experienced evolutionary biologist that were there to be someone or some group of people putting frog gayification juice into the water, things would look a lot like they currently do. Now, doesn't that sound more reasonable? All right. We've covered Bret's 5-point personality. These 5 attributes are what propelled this fictional character into mainstream relevance, and they also each play a massive role in the next part of his story. The Fall. On May 14th, 2021, Bret and Heather sat down for an episode of the Dark Horse podcast they called What COVID Reveals About Our Leaders. They started out talking about the lab leak hypothesis, being very defensive about people who criticized them for being too certain about that hypothesis's viability.
It's not a theory. Right. It's a hypothesis, as is the other. We're not certain engagement.
Well, what's going to come back at you is that you made a flow chart and you said, you know, here and also on Belmar, something like, I think there's a greater than 95% chance.
Well,
and that is read, apparently, as certainty.
Oh, great. Some real plausible deniability there. They then shifted into their next topic of conversation. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say the I word on YouTube without having my video instantly demonetized and maybe even taken down. And I love money, so I'm going to err on the side of caution here and just say horse paste instead. Now, I already know this might upset some of the die-hard horse pasters out there who find that phrase insulting and inaccurate. And to them I would say, yes, you get it. I am bullying you in a mean and unfair way because I think you're promoting a mistake that is getting people killed. It sounds like an insult because it's an insult. Glad we could clear that up, and I sincerely hope your feelings are hurt. Now, to be fair to horse paste, it's true that it does come in a human version. It's saved millions of lives, and it's won the Nobel Prize. And it's done all of this by being a very effective and safe anti-parasitic. It kills all the parasites in a horse's or human's body and poops them out the butthole, which is great if you happen to have malaria or river blindness, which are both caused by parasites. Now, if you're a scientist, you might already know this, but COVID is actually not a parasite. It's a virus, and horse paste seems to do absolutely nothing to prevent you from catching COVID. On the other hand, horse paste is generally a safe drug to take as long as you're taking it in the correct human-sized dose and you aren't specifically taking horse paste instead of something that actually works and is available to you, like the vaccine. So it would be wildly irresponsible for you to use your platform to say anything other than that, which I'm sure Bret... No, Bret... Oh, you already know what's about to happen here. Bret Weinstein saw a couple of very small, very early, and very bad studies that showed some correlation between horse paste and not getting COVID, and he immediately made this his passion project. Bret, you're a scientist. How are you hopping on such a dubious cure so early? You're like my friend back in 1999 who tried to convince me that Lou Bega was going to be the next Beatles. Yeah, I know Mambo number 5, parentheses, a little bit of, is an absolutely fresh track, but maybe let's wait and see if these results can be repeated. So on this podcast episode, Bret brings up horse paste, and I think it's actually very funny considering how important this episode would be to Bret's trajectory, that it seems like he came in with a very concrete plan to talk about horse paste, but he did not let his wife Heather in on it at all, to the point where she actually wanted to cut the segment for time. Like, she didn't think it was that important, and then Bret's just like, no, this is important to me, okay? We gotta talk about horse paste. And she's just like, all right, I guess.
Maybe we should drop some of what we're going to talk about with regard to
horse paste.
I have a lot prepared here, and I just don't think we really have time to get through it all.
Well,
so let's just start and see what we can do.
No, we can't just start. We have to talk about the predicament that we are in on YouTube with respect to
paste for a horse. So, all right, here's the classic Weinstein maneuver, and I've seen him do this so many times on so many different podcasts that at this point it's just like watching a finely tuned ballet. So he starts out with the disclaimer.
We are scientists who are about to talk about scientific evidence. We are not going to make any recommendations as to what you should do, and we are not going to say anything conclusive about what the data say because the data are not themselves conclusive.
Right? Then he gives you the reasons why you actually should listen to them.
However, it doesn't mean the data don't imply things. And, I think YouTube ought to think very carefully about whether it wants to confront two people who have the proper credentials and, in this case, have just been through a circumstance where a hypothesis that they were suggesting needed to be investigated is now understood to be necessary to be investigated, in science, etc. So that's the context.
It's kind of generous to say that they were proven right about the lab leak when nothing has been proven about the lab leak, but okay, we'll go with it. Then Bret brings up the studies about horse paste, which somehow he makes the fact that they are very small in scale sound like a positive.
Large studies are great because they reveal very small effects. When you have a very large effect, you do not require a very large study to see it. The compilation of all of these things is very strongly suggestive that
stallion sauce
does work.
So that's not true, and that's an absolutely wild thing to think, especially if you're a scientist. Like, I kissed two people, my mom and my dog, and they both really loved it. So I should be able to kiss anybody because sample size doesn't matter if the effect is large. Anyway, then Bret paints a picture of a global conspiracy to keep horse paste down.
If the powers that be decide they don't like something like
Flintstones vitamins, but for the horse in the family,
they can establish any standard up to a ridiculous degree that nothing can overcome, right? When it comes to the thing that they favor, there's no level of danger that could be sufficient to call it into question. And so we don't know what that looks like on the inside, but what you can see is the hallmark of it is a double standard that is glaring if you know how to analyze what's being said.
Absolutely.
Then he makes a very bold claim about the shadowy elites trying to prevent you and your loved ones from enjoying the cool, refreshing flavor of horse paste, calling this act...
How many people participated in shutting down this discussion and why? Right? It's mind-boggling. To me, it really looks like crime of the century stuff.
Wow, the crime of the century, calling it only 21 years into the century. I guess Bret and Heather really don't have much faith in the criminals of the world. Honestly, to criminals who are watching this, I believe in you. Shoot for the moon. Shoot the moon. Kill the moon. Kidnap the moon, all right? That would be the crime of the century. Do that. I don't know if that counts as a call to violence, but that's a joke. Then and I shouldn't be surprised by this, but I somehow was, he compares the whole horse paste conspiracy to his time at Evergreen, which, I think the mice telomere story would have probably been a better fit, but he knows his audience mostly knows about the Evergreen stuff, so I get why he didn't go there.
I sometimes say certain stories diagnose the system, right?
Yes, you do.
What happened to us at Evergreen diagnosed the system because the mainstream press couldn't figure out what to do with a story in which for blacks who were behaving in a bigoted way towards whites. That diagnosed the press. This story seems to diagnose the tech sector, it diagnoses the press, it diagnoses the scientific establishment, it diagnoses the governmental regulatory apparatus, all of those things. And we have to take a good long look at what happened because, oh my God, the cost could hardly be bigger.
Mwah, 10 out of 10 landing. That is a perfectly executed Weinstein maneuver. You went disclaimer to outlandish conspiracy theory to making it about yourself. Wow. Bravo. That's got to be it, right? There can't be any more, can there?
Can we talk about cicadas?
Yeah.
No. You got something else?
Yeah, I do have something else. And I have some
sorry.
trepidations about it, but here's the thing. Because we have not been vaccinated, because we have fears, as we have discussed at length on this podcast.
Oh, right. I love this part. So as far as I can tell, Heather had straight up no idea that Bret was going to spring horse pills on her live on stream. And it's honestly really sweet, I think. It's so nice to see older couples keeping the magic alive with spontaneous acts of pseudoscience. To be a grifter in love. Anyway, on air, Heather doesn't want to take the pills quite yet, but she confirms later that she and all of their children are on the horsey stuff. Bret finishes the podcast by saying he's not recommending horse pills. He's definitely not recommending the horse paste to anyone, but they are amazing and they solve every problem.
My sense is that given what I have read, I am not recommending
bobtailed nag barbiturates
to anybody else. In fact, I'm not even going to recommend it to you, but you've seen what I've seen. You can make your own decision. But given the apparent effectiveness of
Shadowfax X-Lax, that's a good one,
at preventing COVID, I feel like I should be on it because as much as no drug is perfectly safe, this stuff, which, among other things, very cheap, but it doesn't have to be taken frequently.
So that was aired on the Dark Horse podcast on May 14th, 2021. And, it's a big audience, but it's not the biggest. But then things took a ridiculous turn when Bret brought his new conspiracy theory and his new miracle cure to the Joe Rogan podcast. Are you surprised? Of course he did that. Now, the Joe Rogan Experience is already the world's most popular podcast, according to 6 out of 10 of the internet listicles I found. But this wasn't just any episode. This was specifically labeled as the first ever Joe Rogan emergency podcast. Holy shit, call 911. There are innocent people out there who don't know about all the horse meds they could be taking.
I've never had to do an emergency podcast before, but I feel like we do. And Bret, you and I have been in communication about this, and this seemed like something that we have to do quicker than later.
Now, I'm not going to take you through the whole podcast because it's a lot of the stuff that we've already been through, but I'll show you a little highlight reel. You get the gist of it.
I'm an evolutionary biologist. The importance of evolution here is that, A, all of the things that we're talking about with COVID are evolutionary. Obviously, the virus is evolved. Epidemiology is an evolutionary process. Okay? This might be one of the most important sentences written this century. Evolution is a kind of good generalist toolkit to apply to something like COVID. Because that number is so high, what it means is that
horsey pasty
alone, if properly utilized, is capable of driving this pathogen to extinction. The pharmaceutical industry has engineered mechanisms to get their drugs through this process, right? They've corrupted the system. And somehow we're stuck in the situation where the evidence that we have effective tools is overwhelming.
Mr. Hans Brand Vicodin.
Do not excite anybody in the pharmaceutical industry because there's no profit to be made. A majority of my family's income comes through our 2 YouTube channels.
Did you watch this episode? Because someone you know did. This was a Joe Rogan emergency. Okay? Drop whatever you're doing and go listen to the beefy transphobe. Bret's popularity on the Weinstein timeline over the next short while correlates almost exactly with the Google searches for horse pills. I just kind of put the numbers into Excel and it gave me like a high number. So does that prove anything? Anyway, I don't know. But clips from this podcast and from Bret's, Dark Horse podcast were posted on a ton of anti-vax Facebook pages, including the Facebook page of Leslie Lawrenson. Leslie Lawrenson was a highly educated Cambridge graduate living in the UK who was a big fan of Bret Weinstein's intellectual dark horse paced show. He would post clips of Bret on his Facebook page advocating horse medication and downplaying the vaccine's effectiveness. Leslie refused to get the vaccine himself, and on July 2nd, he died of COVID. His daughter told the UK press that Leslie was so brainwashed by the stuff that he was seeing on YouTube and social media. He said a lot of people will die more from having the vaccine than getting COVID. Listen, if you don't have access to a vaccine and you decide to take horse paste as a preventative measure, I completely get that. You know, it's better to have a tiny chance of reducing the risk of COVID than nothing at all. But the difference is when, like Bret, you advocate, horse pills as a preventative measure and a treatment for COVID while telling people that the vaccine is potentially more dangerous than the virus. Leslie was just one person who bought into Bret's fear-mongering and had a fatal result. But of course, there were others. The more Joe Rogan and Bret Weinstein fans who decide not to get vaccinated or not to vaccinate their kids or go unvaccinated to their local rib fest or maskless rally, the more chances COVID has to spread, the more bodies COVID has to exist in, and the more it can mutate, and the more people, frankly, will die. It is the worst way to use a platform. Conclusion. I'm going to take this off. I like the way I look. Let's try something. I want you to imagine a world where Bret Weinstein was right about the horse pill stuff, where he was right about everything. He geniused his way into a shortcut out of the pandemic for everyone and is lauded for being one of the first people, one of the only people to see through the bullshit inherent in the system. A world where, he gets that Nobel Prize and people look back on his mice telomere thing and they realize how right he was and how smart he is and how important his scientific mind is for humanity. A world where he can stay up late at night curling the telephone wire in his fingers and swinging his legs behind him on his bed while he talks to Richard Dawkins about how much they both don't like Muslims or whatever. Can you imagine that world? Because I think Bret Weinstein can. And I think Bret Weinstein spends a lot of time imagining that world. I have watched a lot of Bret Weinstein videos, and now so have you. Sorry for how long this video is. It really got away from me. Well, one thing I came away with was, I don't know if I would call him a grifter, per se. I mean, yes, he definitely says a lot of things because he knows it'll get him attention and followers and Patreon money. And yes, I think he's been pushed towards the far right simply by virtue of having a massive right-wing fan base. In that way, he's kind of like the Jimmy Dore of Jordan Peterson's. But I have a feeling that he really genuinely believes the things he says. I don't think he's consciously even lying to his audience, as strange as that sounds. I think he has a mental disorder that I've just invented called protagonist syndrome. And that's why he, for example, hopped on the horse pill bandwagon so early. It would have been a great ending to the story he was a part of, so it had to be true. As much as I don't like the guy, I completely get the appeal of Bret Weinstein. He is smart, he presumably knows a lot about evolutionary biology, and undebatably has the voice of a sexy cartoon scientist. Someone with these skills should be able to offer us some insight on our existence, how we came to exist as we do in the world, and what we can do to make our lives better. Unfortunately, Bret is fundamentally incapable of accurately assessing anything outside of his mostly irrelevant existence. His entire life, he's been unable to offer anything of value to his field of study, except for maybe the time when he was a moderately popular university professor. Anything even remotely insightful he might have been able to add to public discourse has to be filtered through his delusional status as reality's main character, making him a completely unreliable source of knowledge. I know this sounds really, really mean right now, but Bret's human flaws have literally led to people dying unnecessarily, so I don't feel too bad calling it out. In a perfect world, this would be the end of anyone taking Bret Weinstein's opinion seriously on anything. But unfortunately, we live in the world where Bret's YouTube channel is still up, All of his videos are still up on Odyssey, including the ones where he takes horse pills live on air. His emergency podcast with Joe Rogan is still up on Spotify. He's still got a thriving Patreon, and he's invited onto Fox News regularly to talk about the new Chappelle special or whatever the woke issue of the day is. Anyway, to conclude, don't watch the guy, he sucks. I'm going to leave with this completely out of context clip that I think fits.
When somebody, if your pilot, shows up drunk, they need to be fired for cause. If your surgeon refuses to scrub up before surgery, they need to be fired for cause. That's not cancellation. This has to do with the fact that the world functions when people do jobs properly, and some jobs do not accept failures like this. A drunk pilot needs to be fired for cause. A journalist who lies needs to be fired for cause. Why? Because it put us in danger. Anyway, I now feel that issue is clear enough, and if you describe it as cancel culture, that's your failure.